And welcome to today's webinar, Serving Youth Survivors in Detention. I am Marcela Rojas Salas, Program Coordinator for CalCASA. I use she, her pronouns, and today I'm joined by my colleagues from Just Detention International.
Good morning, everyone. This is Chris Mady. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a Senior Program Officer here at Just Detention International.
Good morning. I'm Matthew Van Winkle. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a Senior Program Officer with Just Detention International.
So the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault is committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. CalCASA provides leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. CalCASA envisions a world free from sexual violence.
Thank you, Marcella, and welcome everyone. Just Detention International, or JDI for short, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. It's our fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. And no matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. The California Advancing PREA project, which is how we're speaking to you today, is funded by the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. It allows CalCASA and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California rape crisis centers and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, as well as certain California county-operated jails on the provision of victim services to survivors as required by the PREA standards. While this is a California-focused project, the information presented today is relevant to any advocate with a youth detention facility in their service area inside or outside of California. And we would love to know where you're joining us from today. So we're going to do our first poll of the day. Are you joining us from California or from someplace else? Please select the appropriate response and click submit. It looks like it's almost a dead heat with 50-50. Still waiting on a few more votes to come in. Oh, California's taking a slight edge. Oh, back to 50-50. Sorry, this is so exciting. So we can see it's about an even split. 51% California, 49% from someplace else. Wherever you're joining us from today, welcome. And this is a look at today's agenda. Today we'll be talking about youth in detention and how LGBTI youth, as well as youth of color, are overrepresented in custody, the dynamics of sexual abuse in youth facilities, how to adapt your services to meet the needs of youth in detention, mandated reporting requirements for advocates who serve youth in detention, and prevention in youth facilities. There will also be time for questions and wrap up, as I mentioned. And we encourage you to practice self-care during this webinar. Take deep breaths, step out as needed, stand up and stretch. Any activity that will help you take care of yourself today.
Thank you, Matthew, for the reminder to take care of ourselves. It's always necessary. And so we're going to begin by providing an overview of youth in detention. So what is juvenile detention, who gets sent there, and why? So nowhere in the world incarcerates more than we do. The United States has the highest incarceration rate, both by capita and by simple numbers. The last study done in 2011 indicated that 70,000 people under the age of 18 were locked up in a facility. Youth detention facilities almost match adult facilities when it comes to proportion of boys incarcerated versus that of girls. About 86% of youth in residential placement are male. Just as we see in adult facilities, residents in youth detention are disproportionately Black and Latino, and many of these teens are held not because they're judged to be a danger to society, but simply because they cannot afford court fees. Only a minority of youth in detention, about 28% of boys and 15% of girls, are accused of violent felonies. Many find themselves entering the system for simple status offenses like truancy, so not being in school. In other words, these are things that are not considered crimes for adults. They have, these folks are folks that have suffered trauma already, and even at this young age, and all too many find it almost impossible to exit the pipeline that will unfortunately one day find them feeding the population of adult prisons and jails. So teens and young adults between the ages of 12 and 23 with the most serious offenses are held by CDCR's Division of Juvenile Justice. The division's entire female population is housed in Camarillo. This site and 3 others housed a total of 639 youth as of June 2018, and their average length of stay as of June 2018 was 26.2 months. So a little bit about DJJ and what kind of academic and vocational education they provide. So they also provide treatment programs that address behavioral issues, substance use, and mental health problems. DJJ also operates an accredited school district with the intention of providing youth with the same high school curriculum they would receive in their local community. So youth end up attending high school every day to achieve a high school diploma. And those youth who won't be there long enough are guided through a GED curriculum, and this is really important. Obtaining a diploma or GED is the minimum requirement for parole consideration. Some DJJ facilities like OH Close offer restorative justice groups in collaboration with a nonprofit called The Last Mile, which prepares incarcerated folks for successful reentry using technology training program. So one of the largest predictors of who enters the youth system is instability in their home. Youth who have experienced poverty and homelessness and end up in the child welfare system are much more likely to be pushed into the criminal justice system. Youth who have experienced physical and sexual abuse at home and who have endured bullying at school are also much more likely to be pushed into the juvenile justice system. We also know that youth who are survivors of family violence and homelessness are often trafficked into the underground economy and experience sexual abuse from adults. And unfortunately, youth are often criminalized for being trafficked instead of receiving the services and resources necessary to leave this abusive situation. And talk specifically about identity, we also find that LGBTI youth, gender nonconforming youth, and youth of color are far more incarcerated. LGBTI youth are often kicked out of their homes as a result of homophobia or transphobia, and LGBTI and gender nonconforming youth in juvenile justice systems are twice as likely to have experienced child abuse, group and foster home placement, and homelessness when compared with heterosexual and gender conforming peers. And so we see that conflict with family members leaves them much more dependent on social institutions like group homes and homeless shelters, and are often pushed into juvenile detention centers where their identities are often highly policed by both facility staff and also other youth. So youth of color, we know, are overwhelmingly targeted and disciplined by adults in the education system, and this often ends up pushing them into the juvenile justice system. And this is also known as the school to prison pipeline, which I will discuss further in the next slide. So the school to prison pipeline is a consequence of a culture of zero tolerance that encourages schools to increase police presence at schools, utilize harsh tactics, including physical restraint and automatic punishments that result in suspensions and missing class time. And so we know that when students are pushed out of the classroom, there's a heightened likelihood that they will enter the juvenile justice system. And Black children constitute 18% of students, but they account for 46% of those suspended more than once. Black children with disabilities have an even higher likelihood of suspension. About 1 in 4 Black children with disabilities were suspended at least once, versus 1 in 11 white students, according to a government report by Daniel J. Lowson, director of the Center for Civil Rights Revenues of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. So best practices really show that zero tolerance policies and the overcriminalization of youth of color and youth with disabilities is harmful and does not improve behavior. So instead, teachers should really be provided with more training that provides trauma-informed ways to modify behavior and that challenges racism. So when teachers are provided the tools to be responsive instead of punitive, students are more likely to stay in school and graduate. And so just to provide data on how the school to prison pipeline impacts the juvenile justice system population, I'll share that 85 to 90% of youth in the justice system are of color. That's a pretty big number there. 12% of boys in the justice system are gay, bisexual, queer, or gender nonconforming or trans. About 40 to 50% of girls in the justice system are lesbian, bisexual, queer, or gender nonconforming, or trans. So just to provide some perspective, for every one white straight girl, there are 71 Black, lesbian, bisexual, or queer girls in the justice system. So again, those are really, really stark numbers. So moving on to the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, which is a phenomena that disproportionately affects girls, especially girls of color. And so as we see in the graphic from the sexual abuse to prison pipeline report, girls of color account for approximately 22% of the general youth population, but comprise approximately 66% of girls who are incarcerated. So Black and Latinx girls are overwhelmingly targeted and criminalized for being perceived as quote unquote hypersexual or quote unquote looking older for their age. And this sort of discrimination often puts an unjustified expectation on girls of color to act more mature for their age and really doesn't provide them with the opportunity to make mistakes and much less learn and grow from their mistakes without being punished through the juvenile justice system or through sexual abuse and intimidation. So it's really no coincidence that the majority of girls who are in the juvenile justice system are survivors of sexual abuse prior to even entering the system. And unfortunately, their behavioral reactions to sexual abuse and trauma are often criminalized. So for example, many girls are arrested for running away, substance use, and truancy. Yet many child abuse experts have found that these are warning signs that a young person has been abused and needs therapeutic intervention. And we know that youth who don't receive resources or therapy are often left with unresolved trauma. So once in a detention setting, youth are re-traumatized through the use of restraints, strip searches, and an overall isolating and punitive environment. And as we know, youth in this system are already prone to enter into a depression and engage in self-harm, but sexual abuse often amplifies their depression. So youth with depression and PTSD are even more so vulnerable to additional outside harm like sexual abuse by other youth and staff. And so when young people are punished instead of receiving emotional support, a cycle of abuse and imprisonment is put in place. So it's really incredibly important to have advocates like yourselves support survivors behind bars. And just if folks are interested in learning more about how Black girls have been criminalized and pushed into the juvenile justice system, folks can take a look at a report called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood, which you can find online for free, and the book Push Out, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. So now that I've spoken a little bit about who's in the juvenile justice system and why, I'll have Matthew take it away to discuss the dynamics of sexual abuse in youth facilities.
Thank you, Marcella, for that overview of youth detention and who tends to be there. Pretty stark numbers. Bearing in mind that most of the youth who will be held in detention, as Marcella said, have experienced trauma, sexual or otherwise, before even entering the system, we turn now to what we know about the dynamics of sexual abuse inside youth facilities, what abuse in detention looks like, and how it occurs. We always include survivor stories in our trainings, and today is no exception. We want to feature Troy Isaac, who is a member of JDI's Survivor Council. Troy was abused by a fellow resident at a juvenile facility when he was younger. He was forced to perform oral sex on an older boy who promised to protect him from abuse from others. This is a dynamic that we sometimes refer to as protective pairing, in which an abuser expects sex from a victim in exchange for promises of safety. In the end, Troy was not protected by his abuser and suffered further assaults from others. This abuse was extremely traumatic for him. Troy is now free and is a member of JDI's Survivor Council.
When I was locked up, there was no support services for young people in juvenile hall. When you are in juvenile hall, you don't know what trauma is. You're young. You're young, so you're vulnerable. I didn't know anything about that. You know, being forced to do things in showers, being harassed by gang members. I knew nothing about that stuff. inmates have a code of silence. So it's very hard. And even if you're LGBTQ, it's even harder to speak out. Having rape counselors come into a facility to speak with individuals that have been sexually abused, I think that's really phenomenal. Inmates need to be taken seriously. You have to have empathy, understanding, compassion for inmates that are incarcerated that are speaking out about their sexual abuse. Everyone deserves to be safe in the prison system. I want people to put a face, a human face, on what I'm saying. I just don't want to be just a number. And in most cases, people that are incarcerated are just a number.
So when the Prison Rape Elimination Act was signed into law in 2003, one of the things it called for were ongoing studies to assess the problem of sexual abuse of those in detention, including youth in juvenile facilities. These studies are carried out by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is the source for much of what we know about the problem of prisoner rape. The research team at BJS conducts interviews on a very large scale nationwide of those who are currently incarcerated or who have been incarcerated recently. The BJS publications on sexual victimization in detention are an important resource for those seeking to understand the crisis of prisoner rape. We will share the link to the most recent published report in our follow-up email to attendees of this webinar. And in its most recent published study, the BJS found that 1 out of every 10 youth in a juvenile facility reported being sexually abused while held in detention. And of these youth that reported abuse, 85% of them said it had happened multiple times and not just once. While this number captures reported sexual abuse, it does not begin to touch upon sexual harassment that many young people face in juvenile facilities. So we'd like to ask you to participate now. If you can type in the question pane your answer to the question, who do you think is targeted for abuse in youth detention? Please submit just one answer, as there are many attendees here today. Who do you think is targeted for abuse in youth detention? And you can type that into the questions pane of the control panel. LGBTQI youth, yes, absolutely. The data bears that out. Minorities, yep. Youth of color. And when we say minorities, it could be anyone who has an identity that is in the minority at the facility. Youth with disabilities, yep. Mental illness. Interesting, younger youth, yep. People who maybe don't have experience in detention, who are there for the first time, yeah. These are great suggestions. So yes, thank you for participating. Those are really great thoughts. And as you can see, in the main, your intuition was correct. In fact, LGBTI youth have a much higher risk of being sexually abused than their straight peers do, as well as youth of color. They're also at risk. We've touched above on the fact that these youth are also vastly overrepresented in detention. So someone suggested youth who are younger, and this is interesting, that while in adult facilities, inmates who present as more youthful relative to the average age of the population at a facility are more vulnerable, in youth facilities we find a reverse dynamic, and that youth who are or who present as older relative to the population are more at risk of staff abuse. Youth with mental health issues also face an increased likelihood of being victimized, as well as staff and youth perpetrators alike both seek out victims who are going to be seen as less credible, more likely to be disbelieved. And finally, youth who are survivors of previous sexual abuse are 2 times more likely to be abused in detention than those without that traumatic history. So our next polling question is a fill in the blank. The polling question is, The majority of sexual abuse in youth detention facilities is perpetrated by staff, youth, or neither. Yep, here are the results of the poll. Looks like most who answered felt that neither was the correct answer, that it was youth were equally at risk from abuse by staff as they were from abuse by other youth. And those who felt that staff were the chief abusers and youth were the chief abusers were exactly tied at 32% each. Let's take a look. In fact, while in adult prisons, sexual abuse is just as likely to be committed by another inmate as it is by a staff member, in juvenile detention, youth are 4 times more likely to be abused by a staff member than by another youth at the facility. So this is a big piece of information. When we say staff, it's important to remember that we're not only referring to officers who wear badges, uniforms, but to any adult who works at the facility. This is a group that includes volunteers, teachers, mental health staff, and food service workers. And let's focus in on male youth, because male youth in custody have a greater risk for abuse by staff. 8.2% of males who reported abuse reported that sexual activity with staff, while only 2.8% of female youth reported such contact. Another misconception about perpetrators in youth facilities is around the gender of the perpetrator. Female perpetrated sexual abuse is far more common in detention settings than we talk about. In fact, 94% of staff sexual misconduct in juvenile facilities involved female staff with male youth. Male youth who are sexually abused by female staff are often seen as lucky, and that staff sexual abuse against boys is somehow less serious than it is when it happens against girls. These are stereotypical notions about masculinity, male sexuality, that lead boys to believe that sex with older women is not abusive, but consensual, which makes it less likely that they will report their abuse. Black youth, girls, and boys are especially susceptible to stereotypes that hypersexualize their bodies and frame them as predators instead of as victims. And this is why it's so important for staff and advocates to be able to challenge stereotypes about who can be a victim and who can be an abuser. Much like the child sexual abuse we see occurring in families in our communities, staff abusers often use grooming techniques before sexually abusing the youth in their care. The grooming that occurs usually starts with staff becoming overly familiar with a youth, telling them about their lives, building a relationship with them that is outside the bounds of their professional role. Staff use things like bringing in gifts, pictures, or sharing letters to build up a relationship with the youth. Over time, these grooming techniques make it more difficult for the youth to identify the abuse that's going on, and makes reporting the abuse even harder. And here's some of what we know about youth-on-youth abuse in detention. About 68% of victims reported experiencing physical force or the threat of force, meaning that they were terrified. However, 82% of youth victimized by another youth reported no physical injury. So although there was the threat of violence, that violence often was not sufficient or wasn't carried out. It was enough to coerce the assault, to make the assault happen, but it was didn't leave a trace, making it harder to detect. 25% of those who reported being abused by another youth were offered favors or protection. Almost 20% were given drugs or alcohol prior. And 10% of youth who identified their sexual orientation as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or other reported a substantially higher rate of youth-on-youth victimization, whereas fewer than 2% of heterosexual youth reported being abused by another youth. Let's focus in now on female youth, who are the group at greatest risk of youth-on-youth abuse. They have a 5.4% of females reported unwanted sexual activity with another youth, in contrast to only 2.2% of male youth reporting such contact. Adults find it easier to leave abusive relationships than juveniles, But even when a juvenile would choose to leave a relationship, in a detention setting, proximity to their abuser will continue. So reaching out for help about abuse suffered in the context of a relationship, which goes against facility rules, can result in punishment rather than support if they come forward. And just as in the community, there is less understanding of and support for same-sex relationships, including those which are abusive. Now, Marcella will speak a bit about some of the dynamics of teen dating violence.
Thank you, Matthew, for highlighting how often girls are impacted by sexual and dating abuse in detention. So girls and young women between the ages of 16 and 24 experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence, almost triple the national average. So it's really no surprise that we see girls experience high rates of sexual and teen dating violence in detention settings. Teens and adults are often reluctant to admit that they've experienced dating violence for a number of reasons. And so teens, not unlike adults, often see power and control as a sign of love and care. And so teens may also see the relationships as casual. And so because of that, they end up maybe ignoring or overlooking the abuse to continue the relationship. And especially if they feel it's one of their only intimate relationships that they really hold in detention, then it's something that they'll hold on to. And so because teens are still developing their identities at this point, they're at a higher risk for what we call traumatic bonding, which is a feeling of attachment to the person abusing them. And so I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with this power and control wheel. This is specifically the teen power and control wheel, which was developed by the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence, which exemplifies red flags for youth and adult allies to really keep an eye out for, without really shaming or guilting youth for overlooking harmful behaviors. So we'll have this in a handout, but I'm going to go ahead and go over it. So a few things that we can be looking out for: spreading rumors or threatening to expose someone's quote unquote weaknesses may be normalized or ignored by both teens and adults, but really shouldn't be taken lightly. Name calling, making a partner feel like they're crazy, gaslighting them, and playing mind games to humiliate one another should not be treated as, sort of just like a simple joke, or using one's relationship to obtain social status by treating a partner like a servant is one way that a partner's feelings of self-worth and self-esteem can really diminish and begin to question themselves. Making light of the abuse, not taking concerns about the abuse seriously, sort of shifting blame for abusive behavior or stating that the abuse didn't occur altogether, can make one's partner really lose touch with their intuition and trust in oneself to the point where they no longer believe that the abuse is happening or that they have the right to advocate for themselves. So these are really abusive manipulation tactics that folks will use. One way of using a manipulation tactic might be using death by suicide as a threat in order to prevent youth from reporting the abuse to facility staff. We also see verbal abuse that may be used to pressure youth into having sex. And so, this peer pressure kind of induces this fear of disappointing or angering a partner, which may result in a verbal or physical yes, but that does not mean that there was any consent in any way. And so another thing, definitely not the last thing that I want to mention, but abusive partners may use jealousy or insecurities to justify isolating their partner from friends that they've made in the facility or from participating in programming. And so just like in the community, adults in the facility may not believe that teens even hold romantic relationships, and even further, do not take teen dating violence seriously. So this makes it really really important for advocates to, one, meet youth where they're at and really communicate in a way that resonates with them, and two, implement frequent conversations about healthy relationships in their advocacy. So again, if you want to take a closer look at this handout, it will be provided at the end of the webinar. So again, here's Troy, and in his own words, talking about the upheaval that resulted from the abuse he experienced at the hands of fellow youth while in custody, not feeling like the staff of this facility were in control of the facility, including keeping everyone safe, really magnified the already disorienting effects of the trauma he lived through. So as Troy puts it, being attacked and not receiving support from the adults in charge turned my world upside down. I take that with me wherever I go. And so now I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Chris, who's going to discuss services for youth survivors in detention.
Thank you so much, Marcella. So our goal as advocates is to make sure that all survivors that we may have contact with get the best services that we can provide, so that we can really be there for them along their healing process. So we're going to move on to talk a little bit more about how to adapt services to best meet the needs of youth survivors in detention. And first, let's take a quick poll to see what the current level of engagement your agency has with your local youth detention facility. So the question is your agency currently providing services to one or more youth facility? And the options are yes, some but not all, no, and I'm not sure. So please select the appropriate response and click submit. All right, so it looks like most of the respondents said that they serve all youth facilities in your area. That's really, really exciting. Some with that you're serving some, but not all. And then some folks saying that no, that they don't serve any of their youth facilities. Really great to hear about what facilities you're in. And you know, when we get to the questions section, I hope folks have some good questions about the work they've been doing, or if they'd like to share about any of the work they've been doing. Also happy to hear some success stories. So thank you for sharing that. So before we delve into providing services, it's important from the start to have a basic understanding of the needs of those who will be serving. So there's some obvious challenges specific to being in custody, including disrupted relationships with friends and family who typically provide support, and a challenge to a young person's conception of themselves, brought on suddenly by facing a removal and separation from their peers and their community. Facing time in juvenile facilities creates a sense of loss of childhood, as they serve a sentence in confinement away from opportunities that other youth have. Then, of course, there is what we know about the very real risks of abuse and mistreatment that youth can face in a detention setting. While not every state tracks youth recidivism, the states that do show very high rates, and this highlights the need for advocates who can help break that cycle and offer youth who have experienced trauma the knowledge that they are worthy of healing and that they did not deserve what happened to them. Detention can have a very strong impact on youth development. All adolescents are trying to understand who they are in the world, how they relate to peers, and envision themselves as adults. Being literally separated from their peers in the community can cause them to see themselves as set apart and different from those not in custody. All young people need to learn how to make decisions on their own, begin to have insight into consequences for their actions, and to let that insight affect their behavior. Juveniles are in the process of maturing and forming foundational experiences that will guide their adult lives both emotionally and intellectually. Young people who are involved in the criminal justice system go through all of these stages away from their families, away from home environments, and under the supervision of staff who may not provide the guidance young people need to move forward in their development in a healthy manner. Additionally, when these stages of development are interrupted by a traumatic experience, the young person may revert to earlier stages, or the development may continue in an unhealthy way. Encouraging healthy activities and discussions encourages the growth that will help you successfully navigate this stage of development. They need safety and security. They need to feel comfortable, supported in trying to be an adult, and confident that there are adults to back them up if they need. They need their emotional needs met. And when we work with anyone, especially young people, we want to be mindful not to go right into problem solving, as the people we are working with also need help processing feelings and properly locating some of their thoughts and reactions in the context of trauma. These are a few of the things to keep in mind as we begin our work with young people who are involved in the criminal justice system. Before we start thinking about how we can adapt our services to meet the needs of youth survivors behind bars, we can start thinking about changing some of the language we both hear and use. Youth in custody are adultified by staff, and many in the community assume them to be inherently bad, broken, or beyond redemption. It's very important that we go out of our way not only to not play into the adultification of youth in custody, but also to really use the language that's appropriate. We can intentionally use words that are specific to youth. For example, we would not use the term inmate or incarcerated when speaking about a youth in detention. You might hear your correction staff refer to youth as offenders or minors. We would recommend using the words youth or residents, which are words used by the PREA standards to refer to youth in detention facilities. Always fall on the side of humanizing and seeing people for who they are. In terms of language, it can also be helpful to include your pronouns when you introduce yourself, and always ask for someone's pronouns during an introduction, as this can signal that you are a safe person to talk to for all, including those who may be transgender. This is becoming more and more of a universal practice among those engaged in this work, and it is best practice, especially because young people who are transgender face a greater risk of abuse, especially in detention. Another piece that is helpful for us to understand is the rights of people who we are working with. The juvenile PREA standards apply to all detention facilities that primarily house people under the age of 18. These standards are very similar to the adult PREA standards and require that a juvenile facility work with their local rape crisis center to support survivors. Before we take a look at what some of the services are and what they look like in the context of youth detention, we'd like you to take another quick poll to see where folks are at in their understanding and experience with PREA. So this poll is really for our participants today who work at rape crisis centers. The question is, I have a blank level of confidence around PREA, including the services my agency provides under it. So please select the answer that matches your feelings, high, medium, or low, and click submit. All right, so it looks like most folks have submitted and that most people feel like they have a medium level of confidence in terms of PREA. While this is not a PREA basics training, we do want to make sure that all of our guests are aware that at very least PREA lays out that it's a facility's responsibility to provide youth with access to outside victim advocates and to enable communication that's in a confidential manner as possible. What that looks like from facility to facility can change, but knowing that what PREA requires can help you lobby for more access to services and more confidentiality when providing those services. Building a relationship with a facility is necessary to provide strong advocacy and services to youth who are detained. Every agency and every facility are different, and there's no one way to build a relationship with staff at the youth detention facilities in your area. But there are some recommended best practices that can help things get started so you can set up solid services for your survivors. We always recommend doing a little research before picking up the phone or writing an email to your facility. Looking into the facility's most recent audit can be a helpful place to start. When you reach out to the facility, frame your agency's services as a free way for them to move forward towards PREA compliance. That should always be the way you introduce your services, not as extra or optional, but rather as a way to help ensure baseline compliance in accordance to the federal law. A very important foundation in providing services to young people into custody is to take a tour of each of the youth facilities in your service area. Nothing can be as beneficial to understanding what your needs of your survivors are and the barriers facing their healing than to see the environment firsthand. Every youth detention facility is required to have a staff member who is responsible for ensuring compliance with the PREA standards. That person is known as the PREA Compliance Manager, or PCM for short. And meeting this person can be a great place to start by introducing yourself and your agency. Developing a sustainable relationship requires regular contact via email, phone, and in-person meetings, and should extend beyond the PCM to different staff at each facility. Again, setting up and maintaining a healthy relationship with a facility allows us to facilitate stronger services for our survivors. The juvenile PREA standards require that a facility make available a victim advocate from a rape crisis center to survivors during their forensic exam and investigatory interviews. PREA also requires that those who are in custody have a means of contacting a rape crisis center, whether or not a report of abuse is made. Once you have built a solid relationship with your facility, you can start to set up these core services so youth survivors can reach your agency. This contact can be made by letter, a hotline, and sometimes through in-person support. So let's talk through some of these basic core services and how they look for youth behind bars. When your agency does a forensic exam for youth who are detained, be sure to have a strong understanding of the rights of that youth and how they can receive ongoing support both from your facility and your agency. As always, you will want to make sure that you're getting called by the facility when forensic exams are happening so that you can offer the survivor services. Also, it's important to have an understanding of the laws around minors in your state and to know if notifications are made to that survivor's family or guardians. You will want to make sure to check out what materials that young person can bring back to the facility and what services you can offer them so they can continue to get care. While in adult facilities, we rely on letter writing as a core service we can provide, we find that young people have less access to letter writing materials, and due to changing technology, have less experience with letter writing itself. This means it is relatively rare for youth to write letters as their primary way of communicating with the center. Some facilities offer a tablet that allows those who are incarcerated to send emails. This may be a place for communication with your clients, as they may have an easier time accessing this form of communication. Hotline services are also something to consider. Unfortunately, juvenile facilities have much stricter guidelines on phone use than adult prisons and jails. Youth who are detained often only are allowed one phone call a week and can only make 1 or 2 outgoing calls during that allotted time. This means that a youth may not have access to the phone to call your hotline. If this is the case, you can try to set up scheduled phone calls or have staff facility calls to your center. Although this does mean that it is unlikely that a youth will reach out to your line if they do not wish to make a report or do not trust staff at the facility. Finding a way that youth can readily and easily access your hotline from within a facility will be very important. And all of this is why offering in-person services is so vital at a youth facility, as it is often the best way to offer ongoing support in a meaningful manner. Before you dive into providing in-person support, you need to make sure to have a few things set up. You'll want to find a confidential place to meet with your survivors. Many advocates will meet survivors in the same place that a lawyer meets with their clients, as that is often the most confidential space to meet with people. Others use a room in a medical or mental health area, a classroom, or even a staff office. You will need to have a clear way that survivors can sign up for your in-person services. A good place to start is a self-referral through your hotline, a letter, or forensic exam. If this is the case, you will need to make sure to get the survivor's permission and get a release of information for you to see them in person and to work with the facility to set this up. You can also create a referral process for those who disclose at intake and with mental health staff at the facility. When you meet with a survivor in person, you should always be as transparent and clear as possible about the guidelines around confidentiality that you follow, mandated reporting requirements that you may have, and the scope of work that you can do. You will have the opportunity to set goals for your work together and always be mindful of how that survivor will continue to receive follow-up care, which will very much depend on how long they think they'll be at the facility and where they're going next. Once you have all this set up, seeing clients one-on-one will look the same as when you go to see any other young person in the community, except you'll be going to them instead of them coming to your center. The goals here are the same: to provide emotional support and advocacy, and you'll have the opportunity to validate their feelings, offer coping skills, and help them talk through their healing process. Confidentiality is an incredibly important part of our work with survivors. With clients who are in a juvenile facility and under the age of 18, we need to set clear boundaries about what we can and cannot keep confidential. If you are considered a mandated reporter, you need to follow closely your agency's guidelines if a youth discloses abuse to you that they have not yet reported. Remember, survivors in a juvenile facility may be 18 or older, so be sure that person is under 18 before breaking their confidentiality due to mandated reporting guidelines. If due to your agency's policies, you find that you do need to make a mandated report, best practice is to work together with your client and empower them to be a part of that process. Some agencies have advocates who are not mandated reporters. If that is the case for you, be sure to check in with your supervisor about next steps for that youth. Confidentiality and mandated reporting can be a tricky area, and more clarity and direction we have from the beginning of the work can be helpful. We encourage agencies to have strong policies in place around this and to make sure all advocates have clarity on these policies before diving into working with young people, both in the community and within facilities.
Thank you, Chris. In order to increase the likelihood that youth will seek your services, you'll want to be very thoughtful about how information about your agency and what it does is shared with youth. Printed materials such as pamphlets and flyers which advertise the services you offer young people should be youth-oriented in all respects. They should be eye-catching for a youth who might be walking past a bulletin board or come across them in a facility library, while at the same time not coming across as too informational, boring, or too juvenile, irrelevant. It's a fine balance. You don't want to come off as juvenile or condescending, but the materials should be short as most teens will not really spend too much time with the material before moving on to another activity, either one of their choosing or one required by the facility. But you need to make sure that it's something that will connect with youth as your intended audience. So on your screen now is a detailed view of a flyer developed by JDI for the purpose of making youth at LA County probation facilities aware of their rights and of ways they have to get help. Notice that whereas a brochure for adults might simply use hyphens or numbers as part of a list, the text here is framed as though it is a conversation happening via text message. It speaks to the manner in which teens communicate. It includes emojis. And the big ideas are stated very clearly and prominently, and in a tone that is almost conversational, so that even a youth who might not read this entire flyer will likely see the big print, informing them that sexual abuse and sexual harassment are never okay, no matter what. And the Coalition for Family Harmony serves the California Division of Juvenile Justice Youth Correctional Facility, and they designed a flyer to be posted in hallways and common areas there. That's what you're seeing on your screen now. We wanted to highlight this flyer as we think it's really exemplary in the way it's been customized for a youth audience. It shows two young people reading, which is a common activity at a youth hall, and one that might be even more common among youth who feel at risk or who are choosing to withdraw, who don't feel safe. The fact that the youths pictured are engaged in reading by themselves speaks to the fact that they're not children. They're old enough to read. There are a variety of colors, but they are muted and soft, not the bright color yellows and reds of flyers that might be directed at younger children. Different colored thought bubbles and a variety of fonts give the image energy and draw interest. The style recalls comic books and graphic novels, also popular among youth. The thoughts here also allow youth who might be survivors or might be suffering ongoing abuse ways to see their experience reflected and reassure them that their concerns aren't weird or unusual, a common fear among adolescents. Without being too specific or mentioning rape specifically, the thoughts here indicate the nature of the services that Coalition can provide to young people in crisis, including something happened that makes it hard to open up, which further normalizes the trauma response of withdrawing and turning inward and not seeking help. We want to thank the Coalition for Family Harmony very much for their permission to use this flyer as a handout and training tool today. And toward the goal of building a relationship with detention facilities in your area, youth or otherwise, JDI and CALCASA have created two toolkits published earlier this year. One designed for advocates like yourselves, and it provides information about vulnerable populations in detention, how to prepare for a facility tour, and how to adapt your services for a detention setting. A second toolkit, PREA, a guide to working with rape crisis centers, has been designed to introduce custody staff to what rape crisis centers are and the role they have to play in the overall wellness and PREA compliance of a facility. We're currently working with California's Division of Juvenile Justice to adapt this toolkit to be more youth-specific, but the basic information in the toolkit already available can also be used to educate correction staff with whom you may partner in your area.
We're going to move into an extra special topic, prevention in youth facilities, and how your prevention efforts in a youth detention setting might differ from what you would offer in a community setting. So we are pleased now to welcome Tanji Reese, a Senior Program Officer with JDI, to speak about prevention in youth facilities. Over the course of her career in advocacy and prevention, Tanji has had a focus on supporting young people from marginalized communities and ending gender-based violence. She has held roles as a prevention program director, community educator, shelter advocate, national community initiatives coordinator, and program development consultant.
Thank you, Marcella, and thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be on with you. As Marcella said, I've been fortunate enough to do programming with young people in detention settings through JDI and through a local organization that I worked in previously. And I'm really excited just to share what prevention programming can look like in confinement settings. So it's possible that you've had prevention programs or do some type of prevention programming in the community. Those same programs can be adapted to fit in confinement settings. For example, I facilitated 2-session programs in schools for a while, and we knew that that would not be enough when we went into the Juvenile Detention Center, so we expanded that to 4 to 5 sessions. So we kept the same exact content, but just stretched it out even more to fit and adapt. For this particular program, it was geared towards young men. It was called Growing Men, Making Men, and the folks that were there for crimes that were not related to sexual abuse, so it wasn't a program specifically about sexual abuse, but it is something that we addressed in it. And over the course of that time, we were able to build rapport because the program was really a discussion style as opposed to lecture style education that's usually done in schools. So that's what I mean by adapting it, is just changing the way that you do it, and in some cases expanding that program. Another thing we did was partner with our counseling program. So at the agency I worked in, I was a part of our prevention work, and one of our counselors asked if I would join her to do a group counseling program she did in order for the young people she worked with to get prevention programming as well. So this group was for girls who were in the detention program that were survivors of sexual abuse and were self-disclosed as survivors. So in the program, we did talk a lot about their healing, the trauma they experienced, but we also spent a good amount of time talking about prevention-related topics and talking about moving forward and what they hope for their relationships after being released. Next, another thing you can do to include prevention in a facility is to work with awareness months. So, for example, like Teen DV Month in February, Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April, or Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. So awareness months are our low maintenance way to integrate what you're doing in the community as well. In a facility I worked in, the youth had permission to decorate the recreational area and some parts of their dorm area with Teen DV Month call to action cards. This may not work everywhere, but just work with what the facility is able to do and figure out what's best for them. And this also is something that we provided after release as well. So we use awareness months as just a way to let them know about the work that we do, and it really wasn't a big pull for them. And then they still were able to be with us afterwards. So as I mentioned before, discussion-based prevention programming is the most impactful. A lot of times prevention programs will, like I mentioned, do work in schools, and that is more lecture-based a lot of times using a PowerPoint or activity, and that isn't always the best case for confinement settings. With the program that I did in Michigan, we only had space. We didn't have a projector or anything like that. So we had to use discussion. And what we found is that it was a lot more rapport building. Young people had their questions answered, and we were able to give them a lot more information because they really led and decided what we talked about. So by engaging in discussion, you're really able to get a better understanding of what the group already knows. So here are just a few topics that you may want to consider to include as a part of your programming. First is gender socialization. So gender socialization is a root cause of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Just like in the community, young people may face stereotypes, and these are heightened in confinement settings. So what you can do is just address those stereotypes and how they affect the young person or young people that you're working with, but also how gender stereotypes affect the relationships they have with other people. And that could include staff, friends, family, or their romantic relationships. Next, you may want to talk about conflict resolution and I feel messages. I think this is important to teach because it shows different ways that conflicts can be resolved, and it also provides them with tools for arguing fairly and using self-expression. So young people can be empowered to share how they feel, which isn't really a common thing that happens for young people in general, and especially young people who are incarcerated. So one conflict resolution activity that we used was we had them fill out this form, and they were aligned with an animal, and that animal gave them some type of conflict style. So once they had that conflict style, they were able to learn about how they handle conflict and the benefits of the way that they handle conflict, but also some areas of growth and improvement. And a lot of the young people responded back saying that they felt like they could actually use some of the conflict resolution skills we had. And even if they didn't, if anything, they were able just to get a better understanding about themselves and how they handle conflict. And next, it is possible that the young people you work with are aware or have seen healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships, but may not really have a full understanding of how those relationships fit on a spectrum. So they also can have two common or have had or currently having common issues within relationships. And this activity or discussion can include conversations about jealousy, trust, honesty, controlling behavior, and accepting rejection. One way we started the discussion is by having each person put a fear or a want about relationships into a box. Then we took turns pulling out what people wrote and discussed why someone would have that fear or that want within a relationship. It opened a door for them to see that they really aren't alone in some of the feelings that they have, but also that this is a safe space and a healthy space for them to be able to talk through some of the things they may not typically be able to talk through. And lastly, it's important to address consent and coercion. And in this case, it's important to address it without providing definitions. You want to ask young people how they define it and how they understand consent, and then give examples of what coercion can sound like. This way, it fully addresses sexual abuse. So it takes it beyond just what consent is, but gives a deeper understanding to it. And then again, just like any other discussion about relationships, you can take what they know and add on to it, as opposed to letting them know what consent and coercion are. And we know that in confinement settings, that can look a lot different, that the ways that coercion sounds in the community differs from the way it can sound where they're incarcerated. And keeping that in mind, it's good to open that door for them to be able to guide a discussion in that way. And so just to end off, there are some things that you want to remember when working with young people who are incarcerated and how it could be different from young people who are in the community. There's a chance that the young people you work with may have been abusive partners or have experienced trafficking. If that's the case, one thing you want to do is not shame. You want to approach everything with empathy and belonging. That doesn't mean not, them not being held accountable, but it's just a way for them to know that, yes, this is something that you have experienced or done or went through, but it doesn't define who you are, and that there is opportunity to move forward from that, and that they can still have healthy relationships too. So included in that, you also want to address victim blaming and ways to support others. Just thinking about the dynamics of what happens when a person is trafficked and how people respond. They may not get a lot of that support from other places, but as an organization coming in, providing this education, you can be someone who is able to offer that support. And again, offering that from a place of empathy and belonging and not from a place of shame. You also want to keep in mind that you don't always know the backgrounds of the young people you're working with, or you may not always know the backgrounds of young people that you're working with. So you want to shift your approach to their experiences and know that it might be different from young people in the community. And you want to also make sure that they have space to be able to process through some of the things that can come up in the discussions that you have. And lastly, young people will most likely tell a friend about abuse or harassment before they talk to an adult about it. I know a lot of times we encourage young people to talk to a safe adult, and that can be helpful, but you also want to keep in mind that they may tell someone that's closer to their age first. So that means that it's important to teach young people about helping and supporting their friend, but also make yourself available in the facility as best as you can. they are less likely to reach out for support through letter writing and phone calls. So it's best to be present in the facility and to make them aware of all the services you provide. So even if you come in to do prevention education or teach about healthy relationships, you want to let them know any other ways that you can be able to be around them. It's really just important just to be proactive about it and to remember that most likely they won't come to you, but as an advocate and a preventionist, that it's your responsibility to come to them. So those are the ways that prevention programming can be brought into facilities. And if you all have any questions, I will be around for the question part later.
Thank you, Tanji. We want to close now with the words of another survivor of sexual abuse and sexual harassment while in custody as a youth. Serena's story is also one of today's handouts, which you can view and download in the questions pane, and it will also be sent in our follow-up email. Serena is a trans woman who was targeted for abuse while held in custody at a boys' facility. As Serena puts it, "It would have helped me a lot if I could have spoken to someone who could have told me that it wasn't my fault and I didn't deserve it. If I could have spoken to someone who would have believed me and advocated for me, I believe it would have been better for me." And we want to let you know about some additional ongoing resources. There are answers to lots of questions at JDI and CalCASA's websites. And the PREA Resource Center and the Bureau of Justice Statistics websites are tools that we ourselves turn to often for clarification and insight.
Thank you, everyone. And so now we have some time for questions. I see we already have some of those in that questions panel, but please type any questions you may have. Please don't self-censor. We really value all your questions, and if we can't answer it right away, we'll try to follow up with you later. So I'm going to be moderating these questions, and let's start with some of the ones that I'm seeing in here already. So it looks like we have a question from Courtney that was in the beginning of our webinar to just ask us to talk a little bit more about how gang activity impacts sexual violence in facilities. That's a really great question, especially in areas where there are higher numbers of folks who are gang involved, like in LA County. I know that that's definitely an issue that we see here. So what the studies have kind of shown is that reports where there's been gang involvement and gang pressure, they're also related to higher incidents of staff sexual misconduct. And it also, we see that people are more often to be written up for fighting and reports for gang fights. So I think just sort of a violent nature that can come about through gang violence can definitely impact the rates of sexual violence that you see. But I think in terms of also how you're providing services for someone who may be gang involved or isn't gang involved, that's definitely a consideration to have. And always, again, being mindful of confidentiality and when you're working with any youth or anyone in a facility. So hopefully that adds a little bit more to your knowledge base there, but definitely it's an area where we wish that there was more studies than there is currently, but definitely an interesting thing to think about. Looks like we got a question here from Cynthia about releases of information. So asking if at what point, at what age can a youth sign for themselves, and when is it necessary to have a legal representation or a legal guardian to sign it due to their age. So with confidentiality, releases of information, and mandated reporting, all of these things are really subject to state law. So it's going to really depend on where you're located. And also, I think the main thing to think about this is to have a knowledge of this before you go into it and make sure you know what your agency's policy is. So if your agency works with youth, you should already have a pretty good understanding of age requirements in terms of signing documents such as that. I do know in some places that even if the person isn't 18, that they can sign a release for themselves. But again, you really want to fall back on your state laws and your individual agency policies. Another question here from Cynthia about if you determine that a mandated report is needed, how do you determine who you report it to? Great question. So what we find again is that it's going to depend on the facility. It's going to depend on where you are, what type of facility you're working with. Most of the time, though, it is going to be a report to the facility itself. And at this point, it's going to be really important to know who your contacts are at the facility, who is a safe person to disclose this to. Most of the time, we find that a report has already been made before a youth is reaching out to us, but it absolutely does come up where we might need to be making a report that has not been made. But we do find that usually it's the facility, but sometimes it's a local law enforcement agency, sometimes it's Child Protective Services, but again, it's going to really depend on your facility. So this is something to really, again, flesh out as you begin building a relationship with your local youth facility. Looks like we have a question here from Carla. So working with a PREA coordinator at their local juvenile hall, they were stating that they don't need to be getting audited for PREA. And you stated that you've heard this before with some of the local jails. And the question is, are they not mandated to get an audit? So all facilities should be mandated to get an audit for PREA. So PREA audits are done on a 3-year cycle, so they might not it depends on where they are in that 3-year cycle, but they are mandated to get an audit if they are housing folks who are under the age of 18. They do have to follow the juvenile PREA standards. And that's something we see across the board as people kind of trying to push off the audits, but at the end of the day, they are mandated to get that audit. Question here from Deborah. Are there other organizations having difficulty working with youth while not being mandated reporters? And how are you doing this? How are they still allowed to receive services if that's the case? So what we're seeing is that there are some organizations that are not considered mandated reporters, but it's very state specific. So in California, for instance, there are several advocates where agencies do not consider their advocates to be mandated reporters. And part of that is due to some of the strict confidentiality guidelines in the state. Other states don't have such strict confidentiality guidelines. But again, this is something to work closely with your agency and your facility about, and to have really, really clear policies, especially if your advocates are not considered mandated reporters. Anna, looks like there's a question if there's any statistics on Asian and Pacific Islander populations within youth detention centers. Are you asking about kind of the numbers of folks that are in those facilities? And if so, I do not know those statistics off the top of my head. It's a really great question. I think it's 2012 BJS study would be the one to check out, and we are happy to share the link with you to that study. It really outlines a lot of really great statistics, and it will be, and Anna, that's going to be in the follow-up email that you'll receive. So I'm not sure if it addresses that specifically, but it does do some other racial breakdowns that you might be able to look into with that. Great question about who you make a report to if the person abusing a youth is a staff person at the facility. So should we be reporting to an outside agency? Again, if you are a mandated reporter, if you feel that a report needs to be made, again, we always encourage you to do that with the youth. I think this really depends on what you feel like is going to work best at the facility. If you have a great contact at the facility, maybe a really, really great PREA compliance manager or PREA coordinator, you might want to make a report to that person. If you're worried that that's not going to be treated fairly, or you worry that there's going to be sort of protection for the staff, then that might be a time to go to an outside reporting agency. Under PREA, all facilities are required to have a third-party reporting agency, so someone who is not within the facility. And so that is an option for you when you make your reports as well. So that might be an option that you might want to look into, and you should be able to pretty easily figure out who that third-party reporting agency is, but that would be a conversation with the facility. Looks like Our next question is regarding prevention. So are there any suggestions for building rapport with teens who are particularly resistant to receiving support or participating in prevention programs? And so Tanji, I'd love if you would just take a second to answer that question.
Yeah, sure. So that is a possibility. I think just working with teens and young people in general, there's a chance that there might be some resistance. So first, I would just explore where that resistance is coming from. Is it because they don't want to talk about the topic, or is it because they were having a bad day and it has absolutely nothing to do with your programming? So just taking some time to explore where that resistance can come from, and that can be with the teen, or it can even be just by looking at context clues and having an idea about it. Second, just be adaptable. And know that everything you try may not work. So if you're finding that it's the second or third session and you're not getting the participation that you want, just be willing to switch things up and change it, and giving the young people space to really guide where the conversation goes. A lot of times, young people do like to talk about relationships. So if you're finding that they don't want to talk necessarily about something like gender socialization or conflict, just being adaptable and adjusting to what is most interesting to them. And lastly, I would support just to give space for processing. Even if it doesn't seem like someone is involved, or that they're being resistant, or maybe they're not verbally participating, there is a chance that they're still taking a lot of what you're saying in and just processing it. So I would just say just be patient with them and yourselves. And again, just be willing to be adaptable and change things up if you need to.
Thank you, Tanji. Looks like we have another question here about if we've done a survey on how many youth have been retaliated against by friends of the perpetrator after coming forward, and what measures are taken to safeguard victims once they come forward. That's a really great question. So JDI and CASA, we don't initiate surveys with survivors themselves. We really rely on the BJS information for our statistics. But we do find that retaliation is a very real issue that survivors face, especially if it's a staff perpetrated abuse by other staff, and also if it's youth perpetrated abuse, that friends of the perpetrator sometimes retaliate against that youth. Again, the PREA standards do address retaliation specifically, but how that looks at every facility is different, and how a facility chooses to provide that protection and safeguards varies facility to facility, but it is addressed in the standards. So if what you're finding is when you're working with a youth that's facing retaliation, that's a problem. That's something that they can report, and that's something the facility should address. So that's something I would really encourage you to advocate for on behalf of the survivor, because obviously we don't want to see that, and it is violating the PREA standards and how the facility should be safeguarding that person. Sometimes we see that facility will take measures that sometimes are punitive to help protect somebody, but other things, some people will put someone in solitary confinement. Again, that shouldn't be a facility's first response, but if it is, it's something to take note of, something to advocate for on behalf of the survivor. But again, it's going to look very different from facility to facility. Great question here. If it's against victims' rights to not allow a local rape crisis center into a detention facility. So it's what we're talking about in terms of victims' rights is mostly the PREA standards, and specific the juvenile PREA standards in regards to this particular topic. But if a facility should be working with their local rape crisis center, but it does not mean they need to allow that local rape crisis center into the facility. I think this is where building a relationship with a facility is going to be really, really important. Not an easy thing to do, but without it, we have a lot of trouble getting really into and doing that in-person services. In-person services are not outlined within the PREA standards, but it is something that is really, really great if it can be provided. So I think with this is a great question. But again, I think the answer to your question is really, it's not necessarily against any sort of victims rights to not allow them in, but they should at least at minimum be working with the local rape crisis center and allowing some kind of services under the PREA standards, including letter writing or hotline, but it may not look like in-person services, although that is a great goal to reach towards. Another question here: with suicide and mental health issues on the rise in our youth in general, are there mandates to the existing guidelines on how to handle this going forward? So again, this kind of goes back to state-specific requirements. So as always, for all of professionals that I've worked with, all the advocates I've worked with, most advocates kind of go under the guidelines that if a youth or an adult discloses that they are going to harm themselves or somebody else and they're at imminent risk of doing so, that is a time that we would break confidentiality and make a report on that person's behalf to help keep that person safe. So beyond that, the specific mandates, I would really follow what your agency is outlining. I think it's a really important issue to think about how you're going to work with that youth on making that report, on how you're going to work with that youth in terms of safety planning, because that's always what I would go to first. So I think the more you can educate yourself on safety planning, on risk reduction, these types of things can be helpful, because you're absolutely right. Suicidal mental health issues are on a rise and with youth, and especially with youth in detention. So it's going to be really important that all of our advocates have strong training in working with youth who are expressing suicidal ideation and who are experiencing mental health issues.
Thanks, Chris, for answering all the questions, and everybody for asking such great questions. So as always, if there's anything that, any questions that you have or anything that came up throughout the webinar, always feel free to reach out to us at advocate@justdetention.org or PREA@calcasa.org. We also would love to hear feedback on this training. You'll be receiving an email with a link to a short survey, and we'd be grateful if you would take the time to complete it, letting us know how we can improve, what we did right. It takes about 2 minutes to complete. So thanks for helping us refine our work. And lastly, we just wanted to thank you for participating in the webinar and learning more about how to best serve youth in detention. This concludes today's webinar, and this webinar has been recorded and will be archived at CalCASA's website shortly. So have a great day, everybody.